In Episode 8, we're talking about generations of escape rooms. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Once again, you're tuned into the Mystery Ship Transmissions podcast. My name is Derek, aka Sugi. And right before we get into our subject, I just want to give you a nice little shopping tip when it comes to booking your next room or helping you book your next escape room. Easter, as you know, is coming up this weekend. Sometimes a lot of these companies like to give out discounts, especially around holidays. Not everybody does, but it is always best to go ahead, go out there, check social media, maybe even Groupon, and you may find yourself a good gem of a discount for your next escape room visit. But do be aware that a lot of the times that these deals are going out and that these companies are offering these discounts, those weekends are very booked. So just be aware. Try to jump on it as soon as you can. You could always go on to the Mystery Ship Facebook. We usually post discounts going on from different companies and keeps you updated on that. So go to Facebook, go to Mystery Ship, and like and follow the page for any updates on that. All right, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into today's subject, which is talking about the different generations of escape rooms. Now, for this list, we've broken it down into 3 generations, and this might be a little bit of a different subject that some people may feel a little bit different about. Some may say, "Oh, there's only 2. There's not. Why do we really need to put a label on generations?" Well, this is just a list of kind of breaking down the experiences I've had, checking different escape rooms, playing them, and noticing the different progressions of these escape rooms. And it's not to say that just because you're playing a second or third generation game or that one is better than the other, that's not really the point. It's just kind of giving you an idea of what kind of category that the room that you may be doing, or just seeing the or understanding the progression in which escape rooms have come from and what it could mean in the future. With that said, let's go ahead and get right into the first generation escape room. First generation escape rooms are the first escape room. Very, very basic. The big thing that you would see in first generation escape rooms, or the thing that you would notice first, is the fact that there are a lot of locks involved. Locks, traditional locks. We're talking about key locks, combination locks, padlocks, any kind of locks. That is the basis, really, of how the progression of the first generation escape room worked. Hiding certain locks and hiding the combination into puzzles. And a lot of these puzzles were pretty straightforward logic puzzles. So you would maybe find, for example, you have a 4-number combination lock on the other side of the room, and that would lead you to believe that you need to figure out what those 4 numbers are and that they are somewhere located inside of the room. That is the idea, or maybe even a logic chart. I've explained what a logic chart is. Puzzles like that, nothing that really requires you to put anything inside of any kind of basket or placing certain items on spots of the room or on a certain part of the table. Very, very straightforward. And usually in the first generation games, you would have to, they usually they would give you a piece of paper and a pencil or some kind of writing utensil. Reason for that being that you may either have to keep track of something, or you may have some kind of logic puzzle that requires math. And that subject right there is something that I have seen in a few escape rooms personally. It's not very common as much in the later generation games, mostly because it's not really challenging as using math as a puzzle isn't necessarily challenging, because if you did make it really challenging, then it would almost be unfair. That's kind of frustrating. They definitely don't want to do that. So a lot of the companies aren't really incorporating math into any of the rooms, but there are some of them out there that do. It's not to say that you're not going to see that, or maybe in the future, but things of writing down things, usually they would incorporate some kind of piece of paper or a wipe board that you can use that to keep track of things. So very common in first generation puzzles, or first generation things you would find in first generation escape rooms would be a lot of physical locks, the logic puzzles, and usually those puzzles requiring you to write some things down. Having that said, this really put a very big disconnect when it came to some of the themes of these escape rooms, mostly because padlocks are really industrial. You know, you're not going to find padlocks and key locks or letter locks in a room that had a theme of magic necessarily, or a theme of mystical proportions. You know, maybe you would find it, maybe, just maybe, in something like a heist, thief, mafia, something along the lines of that would fit the locks, physical locks, but it just really didn't work. So it really limited a lot of what these escape rooms could do with the story and the theme wise. And at the same time, some of these companies didn't really put that thought into it. So some people did have certain themes, and you're like, why would they have letter locks in this time period? Like that doesn't work. That really put a restriction on what they could do. But then the next generation came up. Second generation rooms started introducing technology and still incorporating some of the traditional locks as well. But the introduction of technology into escape rooms really ramped up a lot of people's expectations, not just for those who are new to escape rooms, but also those who had already played escape rooms before, but had only known what first generation rooms could do. So with the introduction of tech, the tech was very basic for second generation rooms. Very simple. We're talking about magnets. Now, magnets, what can you really do? What are you sticking something? Not necessarily talking about that kind of magnet. We're talking about magnets in the sense that having certain objects make a connection and then triggering something somewhere else inside of the room. And it's still very much used today. A lot of rooms incorporate magnets. Mostly it has to do with putting it inside of an object. For example, if there was a certain room that you were doing that required you to figure out that you had to put maybe like we'll say a tiki talisman or some kind of tube that had some kind of something that made it stand out, or maybe you had 5 different tubes that you had to place on certain parts or painting, or had to put on certain parts of the table that had certain writing on it. And you had to put those in the correct order in order to move on throughout the game. The bottom of those tubes would have some kind of magnet built into them. And inside of that table where you would place those tubes onto would also have magnets built into it as well, but you wouldn't be able to physically see it. It wouldn't be super obvious. Some of the rooms, I will say this from personal experience, do have very obvious magnets. They don't do a very good job of covering up those magnets, but that could be in part to the fact that those magnets are not very strong and they do need to have a very clear connection, which is something that does happen with second generation escape rooms, which we will get into a little bit towards the end of this part. But adding magnets and incorporating those into the game really stepped it up and really took people out of their comfort zone of what they thought or what to expect from an escape room, which made the games a lot more challenging too. Because part of you doesn't think that that's even possible, or like, why would this even spell out any, like maybe it'll spell out something, or but to actually have it physically trigger something was a big deal. Now, with that said, kind of coming back to what the difference between second and third generation is that second generation technology is a little bit more basic compared to what we'll see in the third generation. Is just the magnets are very simple, nothing too complicated, but there is a little bit of an incorporation that wasn't necessarily polished. So basically, you would find yourself having issues a lot of the time, which even third generation, that is still technology incorporated puzzles are still have their faults. They still trip up. It happens. But second generation, with the introduction of technology, meant that sometimes the technology had its faulty points where it just wasn't quite polished up. So giving it a second generation instead of just throwing the introduction of technology into the third generation and just having two, I like to think of it as the introduction of technology in which it hasn't necessarily been polished up yet, and also mixing up more traditional first generation puzzles. The third generation is really going to be more the final product of technology of what comes next. And also, to add into second generation, we could also incorporate live actors into the game, which is something that is a little bit more on the immersive side, depending on how they utilize live actors or your game master being inside of the room with you. There may be times where you need help. There's been different ways of being able to communicate with your game master. Sometimes they are in a separate room watching you through camera, or sometimes there are some rooms that have the game master in there physically with you, which is kind of weird and campy depending on how they incorporate and making sure that it kind of makes it'd be nice if they maybe had some kind of story that made sense to why that is that they're there. But it kind of takes you a little bit out depending on how they execute that. So for the second generation, we get an introduction of technology mixed with a lot of the things that we find in first generation. We also get the introduction of how that technology uses magnets, which could open up the possibilities of surprise and payouts, things that are memorable in the escape rooms, and then also a bit of an introduction of live actors into the room. So let's talk about the next step from there. Let's talk about the third generation rooms. Now, we're talking about polished off technology. We're talking very high tech. We're not just really keeping it basic with just the magnets or pulley systems or anything like that. We're talking about a lot of electrical stuff. We're talking about the use of hydraulics. We're talking about incorporating and triggering cinematic screens or cinematic movies in which you put in a certain combination, the room lights up differently. High tech stuff. And at the same time, in this third generation, traditional locks are almost nowhere to be seen. There are no more traditional locks. And what I mean by that is that nothing in the room has a padlock or a key lock. everything has to be opened up with some of the technology that's been mixed in from the second generation. So almost all the puzzles either require some kind of combination by pushing a button, certain buttons that's electrical. We're talking about using the objects of magnets or placing objects into certain areas using sensors, which is a big jump up into the third generation escape rooms. Sensors, being able to have an object like a wand and to point it towards a certain object which shows you the clue. Those are so, it just really opened up the possibilities and the imagination and the immersiveness of escape rooms. And with the third generation here now, we have a lot more cleaner stories, a lot more things that will keep the escape room interesting and memorable, where it doesn't necessarily stop you and say, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. There's more possibilities to really immerse the people playing it, and that in turn will make a much more enjoyable experience. So now that we have a first, second, and third generation, is there a fourth generation out there? A lot of people are starting to talk about the use of VR. When you think about it, VR is still very new, and there are still in a lot of ways it needs to be polished up, but it very much so can be the next big step for escape rooms. There are already a few locations that do utilize VR into their escape rooms, and that could really help create less cost for the rental space. It could also really create amazing scenes and fun and memorable moments. But at the same time, there is still a lot of that technology that needs to catch up. Besides VR, the possibilities are almost endless. There's so many areas in which escape room companies and creators can really dive into and create. It's just, we just really have to wait and see what will happen next. And I'm very excited, and I hope you guys, is there anything that you guys are curious, or is there anything that you guys can think of in which maybe the next fourth generation may be incorporated into escape rooms? And is there anything that I might have missed from first, second, and third generations that might be kind of interesting? I would love to hear from you guys. Let me know. Go ahead, hashtag mystery ship. Go onto our Facebook. Leave a comment. Go onto YouTube. Leave a comment in one of the videos. Take a look at it, and we'll bring it up. Maybe do it on a future segment. Love to hear from you guys. Cannot wait. So that is going to do it for this episode. Next episode we are going to dive into is another escape room review. We are going to be diving into Wise Guys by Planet Escape Rooms. And I think that'll just about do it. So thank you so much for listening once again. And until next time from the Mystery Ship, challenge yourself, have fun, and escape well.